How we're beginning today is that we'd like to address how we cut vegetables and fruits, properly holding our knife and properly setting up our station. The way I always begin is I make sure my cutting board is set up properly on my table. I'm going to make sure there's a non-skid surface below my cutting board, could be a wet towel. Sometimes we also have these mats. I put my cutting board down on the table right to the edge of my table so I don't have to reach too far into my table work surface. Then I want to make sure that I'm holding my knife properly. I have an 8-inch chef's knife here, and I want to hold it as if I'm shaking hands with the knife. As if I were reaching out to shake hands, I put my hand on the knife in this manner. I have my thumb along this side of the handle of the knife, 3 fingers curving around the handle, and then I leave this finger across the bolster of my knife. I don't want to run my finger out like this. It puts stress on this tendon that's not desirable for long-term chopping. So I'm going to hold my knife just like this. Knife goes down. Before we begin, we're also going to hone our knives. This is called a steel or a honing steel. When I ask you if you've steeled your knife, I don't mean did you take it illegally? I mean, have you used this tool yet? And so the way that we're going to use this, the way that I've learned, and then the way I would suggest that you guys learn as well, is I hold it straight up and down. The knife needs to rest at an angle of about 22 degrees along the side of the steel. I start at the top of the steel. I drag the knife all the way down to the bottom of the steel. I start at the back of the knife. I drag the knife all the way to the tip of the knife. So when I make my steeling motion, 3 or 4 times on each side is generally sufficient. If I need anything more than that to make sure my knife is well aligned, I'm going to go to the sharpening stone. This is a project, the honing is something we do every single day, multiple times a day. Probably between each project. If you're chopping for 10 minutes, you might need to re-hone. If you're changing from onions to tomatoes, I would re-hone then as well. So honing is a very important thing. When I begin, I'm going to make sure that I'm comfortably standing as well. So I'm going to make sure that my feet are about shoulder width apart, that I'm close to the table so I don't have to reach, that I'm standing straight upright, only my neck is looking down. I don't want to do any hunching, I don't want to do any kind of this business because over a long period of time it's going to generally hurt my back. So I have my knife here, my board set up, I'm standing nicely. Now the way that we do this when we're actually chopping is that I want the knife to be toward the right side of my board because I'm right-handed. So I'm going to have my vegetable that I'm chopping set up right here. My knife arm swings free. Holding my knife in my hand, my knife arm swings free. My guide hand comes over and holds the fruit or vegetable here on this side of my board so that when I'm making my cuts, I have a hand to hold and guide my knife, and then my knife is here. So I'm going to show you right now, we're going to begin with a potato. One thing that we'll notice about many different vegetables and fruits is that they're round. It depends on the application for what we're actually going to be doing with this potato when I'm done with it. But if I'm going to dice this potato, sometimes I don't want the curved edges here to be represented in my final product. And sometimes I'm not concerned. If I'm making a sauteed potato hash that's sort of rustic, well, I don't mind if I have the edges here. But occasionally I really do mind and I want them to be perfect. And so often, and the way I'm going to address it with you today is I'm going to cut off any of the round edges so that we have a flat surface. My knife is in my hand, I swing free. I line up my vegetable here on the right-hand side of my board, and I make the claw motion. Remember, the claw motion means that my fingertips are holding the vegetable, and that my fingertips curl around so that I have a flat surface right here that my knife can rest on for a guide. Okay, so I'm going to set up this vegetable. I'm going to make my first cut here, and I'm going to slice through the potato to make a flat surface. Turn my knife over, spin this off the board. Now I have a flat surface to work with. It's not going to roll around on me while I'm cutting. You'll notice that when I made that cut, I lined it up parallel to this edge of the board, and the potato set up perfectly on the board. I lined it up, and my knife didn't go down straight. If my knife is ever going down, it also has to either be going forward or back. I need to use the blade itself to make the cut. So I'm lining up the potato here, and I go down and forward. My knife slides through very easily in that manner. Now I have my second flat surface, down and forward, and down and forward. Now I have a square vegetable instead of a round vegetable. That's important for me so I don't roll around, but it also will affect my final product. As I said, sometimes I prefer perfect and sometimes I don't mind if there's a little variation in terms of the round edges. So if I were to continue, what we do to make a dice is, remember, a dice is a cut where every measurement is the same. It's a cube. All the sides are equal. And so I want to first make strips. And I'm going to cut first strips into this potato. And if I'm going for about a 1/2 inch dice, I'm going to line up my 1/2 inch, make 1 cut and 2 cuts for a 1/2 inch. There's natural variation in the shape of the potato, so it's not going to be perfect unless I go for absolutely perfect. I'm going to line up my potato here again, and I'm going to make another 1/2 inch cut, 1/2 inch cut, and a 1/2 inch cut. And you can see that I'm going to go for perfect. I'm going to take off a little bit of a wedge here that wasn't exactly perfect. Now I have strips. They're cut in 2 directions. I'm going to make my 3rd directional cut. That's how I'm going to make my dice cuts. This is a good point for us to look at how we can change the cut. We started out making the potato cut by doing a slice where the knife is floating off the board, I'm lining up on the potato, and I'm slicing through. And you can see the potato is very slippery, so you want to be careful when you get to this point. I'm making these slices here. But another very powerful cut is when we do the rock chop. And the rock chop is really how we're going to add speed and keep accurate in our cutting motions. So the rock chop involves keeping the knife tip down on the board, never lifting it. And the knife comes back, I line it up, and then I go forward and down, slicing through the vegetable. Back, forward, and down, slicing through the vegetable. This is a very safe cut. That's why I like to teach it first. And it adds a lot of speed because of its safety. So when I have the vegetable here, my knife comes back against the guide hand fingers and then down and through. Back and down and through, back and down and through. When I line this up here, I'm going to put my knife tip down on the board. My knife comes back, bites into the potato, down and through. The knife tip never leaves the board. I can do larger stacks, same thing. And you see that I'm not moving the vegetable. My hands are walking down the vegetable. If I try to move this entire stack of vegetables around, I'm going to clearly come apart. So that's how I make my 1/2 inch diced potatoes. When I'm finished, generally I don't push off the edge of my board as I just did. When I'm finished, I take my bench scraper, put it into my final product container. One other thing that's important for us to remember when we're doing many vegetables is that we'd like to set up our board in a certain manner. My final product container for me always goes to the right-hand side of my board. I have a waste container as well that I'm not going to leave here, but my waste that's going to be compostable material can be here on my board in a spot that I can easily access it.